Death is one of those topics that we don't like to talk about. In fact, oftentimes we will do anything to avoid talking about death. And we live in a world where there's all sorts of motivations that we have to ignore death, to prolong life. And oftentimes it's the fear of death that motivates so much of what we do and how we live. There's a lady named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and she was a teacher on death and dying and did a lot of work to talk about how to care for people who are dying. Wrote a number of books, sort of late 60s and on. And she wrote a book called On Death and Dying. And one of the things that she talked about in that book is that we live in a culture and a society that will celebrate births, but then we want to ignore death. And even when people are dying, we tend to isolate them. And we're like, I don't want to deal with this. And so we have a waiting room and we just kind of put people out of our mind because we're uncomfortable with the idea of death. But the thing that she writes is that obviously death is something that we are all going to experience. And once we have a firm understanding and a healthy understanding of death and about how life is fleeting, that actually allows us to know the gift of life that we have. Over the years, I've officiated a number of funerals. And sometimes they're funerals for people that I know, sometimes they're for church members, sometimes just strangers that will call and say, hey, we need a pastor to officiate a funeral. And what I've found over the years is that I don't think there's ever any such thing as a really good funeral message. I think there's bad funeral messages. But I think what the purpose of a funeral and the purpose of what Jesus is showing us here is that the correct response when people are hurting is always the same thing. It's presence. It's love. It's mourning with those who mourn. I mean, Jesus models perfectly how we care for people during those difficult times in life as we show up and we're present. We look at death together and we grieve that loss. And we share in that moment in our humanity. Jesus does that here, but then we see Jesus also show this courage. And he has this resolve that in him and through him, he knows that death is not final. That there is another story that is being written through him.